There are nights when the world feels older than we remember, when the wind moves through empty places and carries with it something we cannot name, a weight, perhaps, or a silence that seems to have been waiting. On such nights, if you listen carefully, you might sense that the earth beneath you has seen more than it shows, that the stones remember what we have forgotten, that the dust holds stories we no longer tell. In the dry lands between two rivers, where the sun bakes clay into hardness and the wind erases footprints by morning, there are tablets, thousands of them, small rectangular pieces of baked earth, covered in wedge-shaped marks, pressed by hands that turned to dust millennia ago. Most speak of grain stores and temple offerings, of kings who built walls and priests who recorded the movements of stars. Ordinary things, made sacred only by their age. But some tablets whisper of something else. They speak, in their quiet way, of a time before time as we know it, of cities that stood when the world was differently shaped, of knowledge that came from somewhere we can no longer trace. And woven through many of these ancient records, appearing again and again like a thread that will not break, is a single haunting memory. The world ended once. It was unmade. And then, somehow, it began again. What if that memory is real? Not in the way we demand reality now, with dates and measurements and evidence weighed on scales of certainty, but real in the way a dream is real when you wake from it with your heart still racing. Real in the way a scar is real long after the wound has closed and you have forgotten how it happened. What if these ancient Sumerians, writing in the earliest cities we know, were not inventing stories to explain thunder or comfort children in the dark? What if they were remembering? The Sumerians wrote of the Anunnaki beings who came before, who walked the earth when it was young, who taught and watched and then withdrew into silence. They wrote of kingship descending from the heavens. They wrote of ages so long that no human lifetime could contain them, of rulers who reigned for thousands of years before the flood swept everything away. And then, after that great erasure, kingship descended once more. The world began again, smaller somehow, with shorter lives and dimmer memories. Modern minds dismiss these as mythology, as poetic exaggeration, as the confused attempts of primitive people to make sense of natural disasters they could not understand. But mythology is a word we use for stories we have decided not to believe. It does not mean those stories are lies. It only means we have lost the context that would make them true. Consider this. Flood stories appear everywhere. Not just in Sumer, though theirs may be the oldest written form, but across Mesopotamia, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Utnapishtim survives the deluge and is granted immortality for his obedience. In the Hebrew traditions, where Noah builds an ark and preserves life through divine instruction. In Greek memory, where Deucalion and Pyrrha survive when Zeus decides to drown the world and begin again with better clay. In India, where Manu is warned by a fish and saves the seeds of creation from the rising waters. The stories are not identical. Details shift. Names change. The gods wear different faces in different lands. But the structure beneath remains constant. The world was wicked, or weary, or simply finished. The waters rose. Almost everything drowned. A few were saved, chosen, or fortunate, or warned by powers they could not fully comprehend. And from those few, the world was remade. Coincidence, we are told. Humans live near water, rivers flood, coastal storms destroy villages. Of course they would tell flood stories. Each culture invented its own version independently, shaped by local disasters and religious needs. Perhaps, or perhaps they were all remembering the same thing. Not a river that overflowed its banks one particularly wet season, not a storm that destroyed a fishing village and became legend through retelling, but something larger, something absolute. A moment when the world itself changed, when the waters came, not as weather, but as ending, when the land was covered and the sky was dark, and everything humanity had built was erased as completely as if it had never been. The Sumerian king list is a strange document. It records the rulers of Sumer in neat succession, city by city, dynasty by dynasty. But it divides history into two ages. Before the flood, kings reigned for impossible spans tens of thousands of years. Alulim of Eridu ruled for 28,800 years, Alalia for 36,000. 8 kings in total, spanning a period of 241,200 years before the deluge came. Then the flood, then silence in the record, as if the scribes could not bring themselves to describe what happened in that gap. Then kingship descended from heaven once more. But the kings after the flood are different. They live shorter lives. Their reigns are measured in decades, sometimes centuries, but nothing like the vast eternities of those who came before. It is as if something fundamental changed, as if the world after the flood operated under different rules than the world that drowned. We might say this is obvious fiction. No one lives for 28,000 years. Therefore, the whole list is mythological invention, a way to give divine legitimacy to earthly power by connecting kings to an impossibly ancient past. But what if the numbers mean something else? What if they are not measuring individual lifetimes, but something larger, dynasties, perhaps, or ages, or cycles of rulership we no longer understand? What if the scribes who compiled this list were working from older sources, from memories already ancient when Sumer was young, and they recorded faithfully what those memories contained even when it no longer made sense to them? The tablets speak of the Anunnaki with a strange consistency, not as gods in the sense we imagine them now, not as beings who demand worship and hurl lightning when angered, but as others, as those who were here before, as teachers, perhaps, or observers, or beings who understood things humanity had not yet learned. They are not described as conquerors. The texts do not portray them subjugating primitive humans through superior force. Instead, there is a sense of bestowal, of gifts given, of knowledge shared, though perhaps not fully understood by those who received it. Kingship descends from heaven. The arts of civilization, writing, agriculture, law, the measuring of time, appear suddenly, without the slow accumulation we would expect. And then, after the flood, they are mostly silent, present still in the background of some stories, but withdrawn, distant, as if they stepped back and let humanity continue on its own, carrying forward what it could remember of what came before. This is not the pattern of myth-making. When humans invent gods, those gods are present. They interfere constantly. They take sides in wars and seduce mortals and demand sacrifices. They are intimately, exhaustingly involved in human affairs. But the Anunnaki in the oldest tablets are different. They are fading even in the stories that name them. They are remembered more than worshipped, acknowledged more than invoked. They feel less like inventions and more like memories of something that was once known with certainty but has now become unclear. What was the flood? Not theologically, not as punishment or divine judgment or moral lesson, but practically, physically. What could have happened that would leave such a deep scar in human memory that cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years would all carry the same story forward, generation after generation, until it became the most repeated narrative in human history? The Ice Age ended. We know this from geology, from core samples taken from ice and ocean floors, from the slow, patient work of measuring what the Earth remembers. Approximately 11,600 years ago, the glaciers that covered much of the northern hemisphere began to melt. Sea levels rose dramatically, perhaps 400 feet over several thousand years. Coastlines that had been home to human settlements for generations simply vanished beneath the waves. River valleys flooded, islands disappeared. Entire landscapes were redrawn as the water claimed what had been land since before human memory began. If there were cities in those lost places, and there is no reason to believe there were not, they are gone now, drowned, buried under silt and sand and the weight of centuries of ocean. We have found settlements underwater off the coasts of India, Japan, the Mediterranean. We have found structures that should not exist according to our timeline of civilization's development. We call them anomalies and move on, because they do not fit the story we have already written. But what if the story is wrong? What if civilization is older than we remember? What if there was a world before the flood, not as advanced as ours, perhaps, but not primitive either? A world with its own cities and traditions and accumulated knowledge. A world that drowned when the ice melted and the seas rose, leaving only the highest ground inhabited, only the mountain settlements surviving. Sumer emerged after the flood, according to its own records. It appeared suddenly in southern Mesopotamia, with writing already developed, with complex temple architecture, with sophisticated understanding of mathematics and astronomy. The standard explanation is that civilization developed somewhere else first, perhaps in the highlands, and then migrated to the river valleys where we find it. But what if it was remembering? What if the Sumerians who pressed those first tablets into wet clay were not inventing civilization, but reconstructing it, piecing together what their ancestors had known before the waters rose and everything was lost? The memory would have been fragmentary by then, broken. Like trying to recall a dream several days after waking, you remember that something important happened, that there were places and faces and moments of clarity, but the details have become uncertain. You remember the feeling more than the facts. This is how the Anunnaki appear in the texts. Not with the sharp clarity of recent history, but with the soft edges of deep time. They are there in the background, named but not fully described, present but not quite visible, as if the scribes knew they had once been important, knew they belonged in the story, but could no longer say with certainty who they were or what they had done. In the Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest flood narratives we possess, the gods decide to send the deluge. But there is a moment of mercy. Enki, the god of wisdom and water, warns Ziushudra, a pious king, to build a boat. The flood comes. It lasts 7 days and 7 nights. When the waters recede, Ziusudra makes offerings, and the gods grant him eternal life. He is taken to Dilmun, a distant paradise, where he will live forever. The story is simple on its surface. Good man survives disaster through divine favor. But read it again, slowly, and notice what it does not say. It does not explain why the flood was necessary. There is no catalogue of human sins that demanded such erasure. No indication that humanity had become so corrupt or violent that starting over was the only option. The gods simply decide, The flood comes, the world ends and begins again. This is not how humans invent morality tales. When we create stories to teach lessons, we make the lesson clear. We show the wickedness that deserved punishment, the virtue that earned salvation. We make sure the audience understands the point. But the Sumerian flood story feels different. It feels less like instruction and more like record keeping, as if the scribes were writing down what they had been told, preserving a memory they did not fully understand but knew was important enough to save. Ziusudra is given eternal life and sent to Dilmun. Utnapishtim, in the later Akkadian version, is also granted immortality and placed in a distant land at the edge of the world. Noah lives 950 years after the flood, an impossible lifespan that echoes the long reigns of the antediluvian kings. What does it mean that the survivors live forever, or nearly so? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps it is simply the way ancient people honored those they considered especially favored. But perhaps it means something else. Perhaps immortality in these stories is a marker, a way of indicating that these individuals belonged to the world before that they carried forward something from the age that drowned, something that made them different from those who came after. The king list says, "Kingship descended from heaven twice, once before the flood, once after," as if it were a gift that could be given, withdrawn, and given again. As if rulership itself, the ability to organize cities and command labor and maintain order, was not something humans developed naturally, but something they were taught. We resist this idea. It feels uncomfortable, diminishing somehow. We prefer to believe that everything we are and everything we have built came from us, from our own slow climb out of caves and into cities. The alternative, that we were helped, that we were given knowledge we had not earned, suggests a dependence we do not like to acknowledge. But what if help is the wrong word? What if it was not charity or interference, but simply presence? What if the Anunnaki, whoever or whatever they were simply there when humanity was learning? Not controlling, not commanding, but existing alongside. And in that coexistence, certain things were shared. Think of a child learning language. No one sits the child down and explains grammar. No one diagrams sentences or provides vocabulary lists. The child simply lives among speakers and, through exposure and imitation, acquires language naturally. It is not taught in the formal sense. It is absorbed. What if civilization worked the same way? What if the early humans who survived the flood lived near others who had known more, who had built more, who understood things about stone and water and stars and time that the survivors did not? And through living near them, watching them, existing in their proximity, humanity learned? Not theft, not conquest, not divine gift, just the natural transmission that happens when two peoples occupy the same space and one knows more than the other. The Anunnaki built cities according to the fragments we have, or cities were built for them, or they taught the building of cities. The language is always slightly unclear, as if the scribes themselves were not certain of the relationship. But cities appear in the texts before they should. Before humans, as we understand our own timeline, should have been capable of such organization. Eridu is listed as the first city. Before the flood, it was the seat of kingship. After the flood, it remained sacred, a place of pilgrimage and memory. Excavations there have found layers upon layers of settlement, going back further than our standard chronologies allow. The deepest layers show sophisticated architecture, evidence of planning and purpose that should not exist in a settlement that old. We explain this away, we adjust our timeline slightly, or we assume the dates are wrong, or we simply catalogue the findings and move on without addressing the contradiction. Because the alternative is too disruptive. The alternative requires admitting that the story we have told ourselves about the linear development of civilization might be incomplete. What if development is not always linear? What if it is cyclical? What if humanity has risen before, built before, known before, and then lost it all when the world changed? The flood traditions are consistent on this point. After the waters recede, the survivors must start over. They carry knowledge with them, fragments and memories, but the world they rebuild is smaller than the one that drowned. Skills are lost, techniques are forgotten. The great works of the previous age cannot be replicated because the people who knew how to build them are gone, and those who remain have only partial understanding. This pattern appears again and again in the texts. The antediluvian kings reign for vast periods. The post-diluvian kings reign for much shorter times. The gods, or the Anunnaki, or the ancient ones, whatever name we give them, are present and active before the flood. After the flood, they withdraw, becoming distant patrons rather than immediate presences. It is as if the flood divided history into before and after, and the before was brighter somehow, fuller, more direct. And the after is what we have now, fragmented memory, partial knowledge, the sense that we are living in the shadow of something greater that we can no longer quite see. Dilmun appears in multiple texts. It is described as a pure place, a clean place, where sickness and death do not exist. It is the land where the sun rises. It is where Ziusudra is taken after the flood, where he will live forever in peace. For a long time, Dilmun was considered purely mythological, a paradise invented to comfort the living and honor the dead. But then archaeologists found it. Not paradise, but a real place. An island in what is now the Persian Gulf, called Bahrain, which shows evidence of ancient settlement and trade networks dating back thousands of years. Dilmun was real. A real island, with real cities, playing a real role in the Bronze Age economy of Mesopotamia. The myths had preserved its name and location with surprising accuracy, even as they wrapped it in stories of immortality and divine favor. What else did the myths preserve accurately? If Dilmun can shift from legend to historical fact with the right evidence, what other elements of these ancient stories might be waiting for the same transformation? What other names and places and events might be real, buried under layers of poetry and time, waiting to be recognized? The Sumerian texts speak of Me, a word that defies easy translation. It refers to the fundamental principles of civilization, the attributes of culture, the knowledge required to build and sustain complex society. In one story, Inanna travels to Eridu and receives the Me from Enki while he is drunk. She takes them back to her city, Uruk, and Uruk flourishes because it now possesses what it lacked before. The Me are not abstract. The texts list them: kingship, priesthood, writing, music, metalworking, law, judgment, the art of war, the art of peace. Concrete skills and knowledge, treated as transferable objects that can be given or stolen or lost. This is a strange way to think about civilization. We understand it as emergent, as something that develops gradually through trial and error and accumulated experience. But the Sumerians wrote about it as if it were a set of instructions, as if someone, at some point, possessed all the knowledge required for civilization, and passed it on deliberately or accidentally to those who did not have it. Before the flood, the Emmy existed. After the flood, they had to be recovered, redistributed, reinstalled in the cities that would carry them forward, as if the deluge had not only drowned the world but scattered its knowledge, leaving the survivors to gather up what pieces they could find and rebuild with incomplete instructions. Humanity, in this telling, is not the author of its own civilization. It is the inheritor, the caretaker of something older, given to it by those who came before, maintained imperfectly through ages of forgetting and remembering and forgetting again. The Anunnaki are named in the texts but rarely described. Anu, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag. These names appear consistently, but their nature remains elusive. They are called gods, but they do not behave like the gods of later mythology. They do not require constant worship. They do not perform miracles on demand. They seem bound by their own rules, limited in ways that omnipotent deities should not be. They argue among themselves. They make decisions collectively. They are surprised by outcomes. They regret choices. These are not the characteristics of beings humans invent when creating gods to explain thunder and harvest. These are the characteristics of beings who were remembered as powerful, as knowledgeable, as other, but still mortal in some fundamental sense, still bound to cause and effect, still capable of error. What if the Anunnaki were not gods at all, but simply the ones who came before, the ones who knew more because they had lived longer, built longer, remembered longer? What if divinity was attributed to them later by people so far removed from the original contact that they could no longer imagine their ancestors as anything but servants to powers beyond human comprehension? This is how memory works. It simplifies, it elevates, it transforms the unfamiliar into the mythological, because mythology is easier to carry forward than complexity. A story about gods is more durable than a story about a forgotten people who once lived in cities we can no longer find. But the earliest texts do not feel like simplification. They feel like something else, like preservation, like an attempt to write down what was known before it could be forgotten entirely. The Epic of Atrahasis, older even than Gilgamesh, describes the creation of humans in functional terms. The gods, the Anunnaki, are laboring. They are digging canals, carrying earth, doing the physical work required to make the land habitable. They grow weary. They complain. And so a solution is devised. Humans are created to bear the burden of labor, to do the work the gods no longer wish to do. This is not a grand metaphysical statement about humanity's spiritual purpose. It is practical, almost mundane. Humans are made to work, to farm and build and maintain the irrigation systems that keep the fields watered and the cities fed. And for a time, this arrangement functions. Humans multiply. They labor. The gods rest. But then humans become too numerous, too noisy. They disturb the peace. And so the gods decide to reduce their numbers, first through plague, then through famine, and finally, when these prove insufficient, through flood. But Enki, who has always favored humanity, or perhaps simply opposes the decision on principle, warns Atrahasis. He tells him to build a boat to save himself and his family and the animals. The flood comes. The world drowns. And when the waters recede, the surviving gods realize they have made a mistake. Without humans to do the work, they will have to labor again themselves. And so they allow humanity to continue, but with limitations now. Shorter lifespans, increased hardship, a world less generous than the one that drowned. This story does not sound like theology. It sounds like history told from a great distance, like an account of events that actually happened, filtered through so many retellings that the facts have become soft, but the structure remains. If the Anunnaki were real, not as gods, but as a people, a civilization, a group that existed before the flood and possessed knowledge the survivors did not, then this story makes a different kind of sense. Not metaphorical sense, not symbolic sense, but practical, historical sense. They built the early infrastructure. They organized the labor. They taught the methods. And humanity learned by doing. And then the flood came, and the Anunnaki, whoever they were, did not survive in numbers sufficient to continue. Perhaps they lived in the lowlands, in the coastal regions that drowned when the ice melted. Perhaps their cities were the ones now buried under ocean and silt. And the humans who did survive, those who lived in the highlands, in the mountains, in places the water could not reach, were left with fragments, with half-remembered techniques and incomplete understanding, with stories of teachers who were gone now, who had once shown them how to measure the stars and mark the seasons and build walls that would stand against time. And so they did what survivors always do. They carried forward what they could. They wrote it down when writing was reinvented. They built new cities, modelled on the ones they remembered. They passed on the knowledge, even when they no longer understood where it came from. The flood traditions across cultures share another detail. After the waters recede, there is a covenant, a promise. God promises Noah that the flood will not come again. The rainbow is given as a sign. In the Sumerian version, the gods promise Yasudra eternal life as compensation for what was lost. In other traditions, the survivors are blessed, given new commandments, assured that the world will continue. Why does every version include this reassurance? Perhaps because the trauma of the flood was so deep that those who survived needed to believe it would not happen again. That the world, having been unmade once, would not be unmade again. That the ground beneath their feet was now stable, the future now secure, or perhaps because there was an actual promise, an actual agreement between those who survived and those who had known what was coming. A compact that, yes, the world had ended, but it would be allowed to continue now. Humanity would be permitted to rebuild, to carry forward, to become what it could become without further interference. The Anunnaki, in the later texts, are present but inactive. They watch. They observe. They occasionally intervene in small ways, a warning here, a favor there, but they no longer shape events the way they did before the flood. They have withdrawn to the background, allowing humanity to determine its own path. This pattern does not match divine behavior as we typically imagine it. Gods do not withdraw. They do not step back and let their creation proceed independently. They remain involved, demanding, present. But teachers do. Guides do. Those who were never gods to begin with, only more knowledgeable, do. They share what they know, and then they step aside, trusting or hoping that what they have taught will be enough. What if the global reset was not punishment but necessity, not judgment but consequence? The ice melted because the climate changed. The seas rose because the water had to go somewhere. The lowland civilizations drowned because they were in the path of forces no one could control. And in the aftermath, the survivors, both human and Anunnaki, if we allow that possibility, made a choice to rebuild, to preserve what could be preserved, to teach what could be taught, and then, when the teaching was done, to withdraw, to let humanity carry the knowledge forward on its own. The Sumerian records hint at this in their strange way. They do not describe conquest. They do not describe enslavement. They describe bestowal and withdrawal, presence and then absence. A world where the Anunnaki were intimately involved, and then a world where they were not. What changed? The flood changed. The world changed. The conditions that allowed whatever relationship existed before the flood were washed away, and what emerged afterward was different, smaller, more isolated. Humanity on its own now, with only memory and fragments to guide it. There is a text called the Sumerian King List that modern scholars largely dismiss as legendary. But embedded in its impossible chronology is a pattern worth noticing. Before the flood, there are 8 kings across 5 cities. After the flood, the number of cities increases rapidly. Kish, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Umma, dozens of city-states emerging in the river valleys of Mesopotamia, each with its own rulers, its own traditions, its own temples. It is as if centralized authority dissolved after the flood, as if whatever unified structure existed before, whatever allowed kingship to be held by so few for so long, broke apart, and in the breaking allowed something new to emerge, not better necessarily, not worse, just different, more human-scaled, more independent. The cities that emerged after the flood competed with one another. They formed alliances and broke them. They fought over water rights and trade routes and the favour of gods who seemed increasingly distant. This is the Sumer we know from archaeology. Quarrelsome, brilliant, innovative and fragmented. But the texts remember another Sumer, an earlier one, where Eridu stood alone as the first city, where kingship was singular and descended from heaven, where the Anunnaki walked among humans and the world operated under different principles. That world drowned, and what rose from the water was ours, familiar, recognizable, human in scale and error and ambition. The tablets that survive are copies of copies. The original texts, if they ever existed in a definitive form, are long gone. What we have are versions written 1,000 years, 2,000 years after the events they describe. Scribes in later periods copying from older tablets, preserving stories whose meanings they may not have fully understood, and yet they copied faithfully. They preserved the strange details, the impossible lifespans, the gods who did not quite behave like gods, the flood that ended everything and allowed it to begin again. Why preserve these things if they were obvious fiction? Why not edit them, smooth them out, make them more reasonable? The scribes had that power. They could have changed the numbers, simplified the narrative, made the king list align with what they knew to be possible. But they did not. They copied what they found, contradictions and all, as if they understood that their job was not to interpret but to preserve, as if they knew that these texts contained something important, even if they could no longer say exactly what. We do the same thing now in our own way. We preserve documents we do not fully understand because we sense their importance. We archive languages we no longer speak, traditions we no longer practice, knowledge we cannot immediately use. We do this because some part of us knows that forgetting is dangerous, that what seems irrelevant now may become essential later, that the past holds answers to questions we have not yet learned to ask. The Sumerians preserved their past even when it stopped making sense. Even when the world they described seemed impossibly distant from the world they inhabited. They kept copying the tablets, generation after generation, because the tablets were old, and oldness itself was sacred. What did they sense that we have forgotten? What did they understand about the fragility of knowledge, about how easily whole civilizations can slip beneath the surface of memory and leave only ripples behind? The flood traditions speak of warning. Someone always knows the flood is coming. Enki warns Ziushudra. God warns Noah. Prometheus warns Deucalion. In every version there is foreknowledge. Someone sees what is approaching and chooses to save a remnant. This is an odd detail if the stories are purely mythological. Myths do not typically require advance warning. The gods simply act, and mortals suffer or benefit accordingly. But flood stories consistently include this element of preparation. Build a boat, gather your family, take the animals, survive what is coming. It suggests that whatever the flood was, it was not instantaneous. There was time between knowing and drowning, time to prepare, time to choose what to save and what to leave behind. If the flood was the melting of the Ice Age glaciers, then yes, there would have been warning, not a voice from heaven, but observable signs. The climate warming, the glaciers receding, the rivers swelling, coastal settlements finding themselves closer to the water each year, and then each season, and then each day. Those who were watching the patterns, the wise ones, the knowledgeable ones, those who understood the relationship between ice and water and time, would have known what was coming. They would have seen it building, and they would have tried to warn those who would listen. Most would not have listened. This, too, is consistent in the stories. The flood comes, and only a handful survive, because only a handful believed the warning. The rest went about their lives, confident that the world they knew would continue as it always had. This is how humans behave in the face of slow catastrophe. We do not evacuate until the fire is visible. We do not flee until the water is already rising. We trust in normalcy because normalcy is all we have ever known. But a few listen, a few prepare. And when the world changes, those few become the carriers of what was. They are the bridge between the age that ended and the age that begins. Ziusudra, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim, Noah. Different names in different languages, but perhaps the same function. Perhaps even the same memory, distorted by distance and translation, but pointing toward the same truth. Someone survived who should not have. Someone carried forward knowledge that should have drowned. Someone became the link between before and after. The texts describe what the survivors saved: seeds, animals, the fundamental elements of life, but also, in some versions, tablets, records, the ME, the sacred knowledge, preserved on clay or stone or carried in memory so that what was known would not be entirely lost. This is not primitive thinking. This is sophisticated understanding of how civilizations die, not just through the loss of people, but through the loss of knowledge. 1,000 skilled workers can drown, and if even one master craftsman survives, the skill can be relearned. But if all who know are lost, the skill dies with them, and those who come after must reinvent it from nothing. The survivors of the flood, in every tradition, are described as wise, as chosen for their wisdom or piety or obedience, but ultimately for their ability to understand what was coming and act accordingly. They are not random refugees. They are selected preservers, deliberate carriers of what must not be forgotten. And what they preserved was not just life. It was the memory of what life had been, the knowledge of what had been built, the understanding that the world drowned because it could drown, and therefore the new world must be built differently, on higher ground, with the awareness that nothing is permanent. This awareness runs through all the post-flood civilizations. The Sumerians built on tells artificial hills that raised their cities above the floodplains. They developed elaborate irrigation systems because they understood that water was both life and death, that it must be controlled or it would control them. They recorded everything obsessively, pressing thousands upon thousands of tablets with information that seems trivial: grain receipts, temple inventories, birth records, because they understood that memory without record is fragile. They were a civilization built on the consciousness of ending, on the knowledge that what had been lost could be lost again, on the determination to preserve, to record, to pass forward. The Anunnaki fade from active presence in the texts after the flood, but they do not disappear entirely. They remain in the background, referenced in ritual, honored in temple architecture, named in prayers. But they no longer walk among humans. They no longer teach directly. They have become distant patrons, watching from wherever they have withdrawn to, involved only tangentially in the affairs of the cities that remember them. Why this withdrawal? If they were merely invented gods, there would be no reason for them to become less present over time. Gods do not typically choose to become less involved with their worshippers. If anything, the pattern should reverse: early gods being distant and abstract, later gods becoming more personal and interventionist as religious thought develops. But the Sumerian pattern is the opposite. The Anunnaki are most present in the earliest periods, most active, most directly involved, and then they fade, becoming more abstract, more distant, more mythological as time passes. This is the pattern of memory, not invention. It is what happens when something real recedes into the past and becomes legend. The details blur, the presence diminishes. The immediate fades into the remembered, and the remembered fades into the imagined. If the Anunnaki were a real people, a civilization that existed before the flood and taught the survivors what they knew, then their gradual disappearance from the texts makes perfect sense. They were there. Then they were not. And each generation that followed knew them less directly, understood them less fully, until finally they became what they are to us now: names in ancient stories, hints of something that may have been. The flood divided history. This is the one clear message in all the traditions. There was before, there was after, and they were not the same. Before was longer lived, more knowledgeable, more directly connected to whatever the Anunnaki were. After was shorter, harder, more fragmented. Before, humanity was taught. After, humanity had to remember and rebuild with what teaching remained. We live in the after. All of recorded history exists in the after. Everything we think we know about the development of civilization comes from the world that emerged when the waters receded. But the texts insist there was a before, and that the before was not primitive, not savage, not waiting in darkness for the light of civilization to dawn. The before had cities, it had kingship, it had knowledge of the stars and the seasons and the movement of time. It had the ME, the fundamental principles of organized society. It had the Anunnaki, teaching or guiding or simply present in ways that made their absence later noticeable. and then the waters rose, and the before drowned. And what survived had to rebuild from fragments, from half-remembered techniques, from stories that became increasingly garbled with each retelling, until finally they solidified into myth, into religion, into the tales we tell ourselves about gods and floods and the beginning of the world. But beneath the myth, the memory persists. Beneath the religion, the history whispers. Beneath the tales we tell, the truth waits, patient and drowned, in the silt of forgotten coastlines and the clay of ancient tablets. The archaeologists who first excavated Sumerian sites in the 19th century found something they did not expect. Beneath the ruins of the cities they knew from the Bible and from Greek historians, beneath the Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar and the Ur of Abraham, they found older layers, much older. Cities built on cities, each one buried by time and sand and the slow accumulation of centuries. And in the deepest layers, in the oldest settlements they could reach, they found evidence of sophisticated planning. Streets laid out in grids, drainage systems, temples built to alignments that suggested astronomical knowledge. This should not have existed, according to the timeline they carried with them. Civilization was supposed to develop slowly, gradually, from simple to complex. But the oldest Sumerian settlements were not simple. They were already complex, already organized, as if they had been built by people who already knew how to build cities because they had built cities before. The excavators found a layer of silt, a clean silt, deposited by water, separating the oldest settlements from those above. A flood layer, evidence that at some point the region had been inundated, covered by water that left its mark in the earth and then receded. When they found this layer, some of them thought they had found proof of the biblical flood, evidence that Noah's flood was real, that the story was history disguised as scripture. But the layer was local, not global. It showed flooding in Mesopotamia, but not a deluge that covered the entire earth. Still, it was real. The flood had happened, not mythologically, not symbolically, actually. Water had risen, covered the settlements, killed those who could not escape, and left behind a mark in the earth that would survive for thousands of years. What if there were other flood layers we have not found yet? What if the ones drowned most completely left no trace we can reach? The coastlines that vanished when the ice melted are now under hundreds of feet of ocean. We cannot excavate there easily. We cannot dig through water and silt and the crushing weight of the sea to find what lies beneath. But sometimes the ocean gives back what it has taken. Sometimes storms shift the sand, or tides retreat, or fishermen snag their nets on stones that should not be there. And when we investigate, we find walls, structures, evidence of human habitation in places that have been underwater for 10,000 years. Off the coast of India, near Gujarat, there are ruins. Stone structures arranged in patterns that suggest streets, buildings, a settlement of significant size. They rest beneath 120 feet of water. Dating is difficult in such conditions, but the estimates place them at 9,500 years old, before the Sumerian cities, before the Egyptian dynasties, before any civilization we have acknowledged in our official timelines. Near the island of Yonaguni, off Japan, there is a formation. Some call it natural, an accident of geology, but it has steps, right angles, flat plains that seem deliberately carved. If it is a structure, if it was made by human hands, then it predates the flood by thousands of years. In the Mediterranean, off the coast of Alexandria, There are entire neighborhoods underwater, temples and statues and houses that slipped beneath the waves when the land subsided, or the sea rose, or both. These are more recent Ptolemaic, Roman, but they show how easily cities can vanish beneath water, how completely the ocean can erase what was. If cities that sank 2,000 years ago are only now being properly explored, what of cities that sank 10,000 years ago? How many wait still, unnoticed, beneath shipping lanes and fishing grounds, in waters too deep or too murky to search? The Sumerians wrote that Eridu was the first city, that before the flood it was the seat of kingship, the place where civilization began. Excavations at Eridu have found 22 layers of settlement, one built atop another, going back to approximately 5,000 of 400 BCE. But 5,400 BCE is after the flood, according to geological timelines. The Ice Age ended around 11,600 years ago. The sea level rise happened over several thousand years after that. By 5,400 BCE, the waters had long since stabilized. So if Eridu was the first city, and Eridu was built after the flood, then what was there before? What drowned settlements might have preceded Eridu, their ruins now buried where we cannot easily reach them, their names forgotten except in stories that have become too mythological to trust? The king list says kingship descended from heaven at Eridu. Then the flood came. Then kingship descended from heaven again at Kish, two separate bestowals with the deluge between them. What if kingship did descend, not from heaven in the theological sense, but from somewhere else, from survivors who carried the knowledge of governance with them, from refugees of the drowned coastlands who moved inland and taught the highland people how to organize, how to build, how to transform scattered villages into something greater? This would not require gods. It would only require difference. A group that knew more, arriving among a group that knew less. The knowledge transfer would be organic, inevitable, and to those receiving it, it might seem like a gift from above, like power descending from somewhere beyond their understanding. The texts preserve this sense of wonder, of receiving something unearned, of being given knowledge that transformed everything, not because the gods loved humanity, but because someone, the Anunnaki, the predecessors, the ones who came before, chose to share what they knew before it was lost entirely. And perhaps they did this not out of altruism, but out of desperation, because they were dying, because their cities were drowning, because they saw that their world was ending and wanted something of what they knew to survive, even if they themselves could not. So they taught, they shared, they bestowed the ME, the sacred knowledge, on those who might carry it forward. And then, as their numbers dwindled and their cities vanished beneath the rising water, they withdrew, not to heaven, not to some distant paradise, simply to the margins, to the edges of the new world that was forming, to the places where they could watch and remember and perhaps occasionally help in small ways. The myths remember them as immortal, but what if immortality meant only that they outlived their civilization, that they persisted after their world ended, that they lived long enough to see what came after and know that something of what they had been would continue in the societies they had taught? Ziushudra lives forever in Dilmun. Utnapishtim lives forever at the edge of the world. They are not gods. The texts are clear on this. They are humans, exceptional, chosen, preserved, but mortal in origin. Their immortality is a reward, a transformation, a consequence of surviving what should have killed them. What if this reflects a historical truth, that some did survive, impossibly, through the worst of the flooding, that they lived long lives in the new world, lives that seemed impossibly long to those who knew them, because they carried with them the vigor and knowledge of the world before. And when they finally died, as all mortal things must, the stories transformed their long lives into eternal ones, because that is what memory does. It exaggerates. It preserves the feeling of a thing even when it distorts the facts. The feeling that these individuals were different, were special, were connected to a time that had passed, survived intact in the stories, even as the details became myth. The gods argue among themselves in the Sumerian texts. They disagree about the flood. Enlil wants to destroy humanity. Enki wants to save them. A compromise is reached. Humanity survives, but diminished. Reduced in number and lifespan and power. This does not sound like omnipotent beings deciding the fate of creation. It sounds like a council, a debate. People with differing views coming to a decision they can all accept, even if none are entirely satisfied. What if the Anunnaki were exactly that? A council, a governing group from the civilization before, trying to decide what to do as their world ended. Some advocating for complete withdrawal, letting the flood run its course, and whatever survived, survived. Others arguing for intervention, for teaching, for ensuring that humanity would not have to rebuild entirely from nothing. And the compromise: they would help, but not control. They would teach, but then withdraw. They would give the knowledge, the ME, the fundamental principles, and then let humanity determine its own path forward. This would explain the pattern in the texts. The heavy involvement before and immediately after the flood. The gradual withdrawal in the generations that followed. The fading from active presence to distant memory. They kept their part of the agreement. They taught what they could, preserved what they could, and then stepped back. And humanity, carrying forward the fragments they had been given, built new civilizations in new places, different from what came before, but still carrying the echo of it. Sumer itself lasted less than 2,000 years as a distinct civilization. By 2000 BCE, it had been absorbed into the Akkadian Empire, its language becoming a liturgical tongue used in temples but no longer spoken in streets. And yet the stories survived. The tablets were copied by Akkadians, by Babylonians, by Assyrians. Each empire that rose in Mesopotamia preserved the Sumerian texts, treating them as sacred, as foundational, even when the people who wrote them were long gone. Why this reverence for a dead language and a vanished people? Perhaps because those later civilizations understood something we have forgotten, that Sumer was not the beginning, that the Sumerians themselves were inheritors, preservers, carriers of something older, and that the tablets they left behind contained not just their own history, but the history of what came before them. The later scribes copied the king list faithfully, impossible numbers and all. They copied the flood stories. They copied the references to the Anunnaki, even as their own theologies evolved in different directions. They preserved these texts because the texts were old, and oldness implied authority, implied connection to a time when things were known with greater certainty. We have lost this instinct. We privilege the new over the old, the recent over the ancient. We assume that knowledge accumulates linearly, that we know more now than was ever known before. And in many domains, this is true. But in some things, in memory, in continuity, in the preservation of what was, we may know less than those who came before us. The Sumerians knew they were not the first. Their own texts told them so. They knew there was a world before the flood, and they knew that world had possessed knowledge they were still trying to reconstruct. This awareness runs through their literature, the sense that they were living in aftermath, that they were building atop ruins, that the golden age was behind them, not ahead. We call this pessimism. We prefer narratives of progress, of improvement, of ascending toward better futures. But what if the Sumerian perspective was more accurate? What if they understood something about the cyclical nature of civilization that we have chosen to forget? Civilizations rise. They grow complex. They develop technologies and arts and systems of knowledge, and then they fall, sometimes gradually, through internal decay. Sometimes suddenly, through conquest or disaster or collapse. And when they fall, much of what they knew falls with them. The survivors rebuild. They use what fragments remain. They reinvent what they can. But the new civilization is not identical to the old. It is different. Shaped by different circumstances, different needs, different understandings. The flood was one such collapse. Perhaps the greatest in human memory. Because it was not just the fall of a single civilization, but the transformation of the entire world. When the ice melted and the seas rose, every coastal civilization would have been affected. Every river delta, every island, every settlement built where land met water. The world after the flood was geographically different from the world before. Entire regions were submerged. New coastlines formed, rivers changed their courses, the landscape itself was rewritten, and humanity, which had spread across the old coastlines, which had built its earliest settlements near water because water meant life, had to move inland, upland, to places that remained above the rising tide. This migration would have mixed populations that had previously been separate. It would have brought together different groups, different traditions, different knowledge bases, and in the mixing, some things would have been preserved, combined, enhanced, but other things would have been lost. Specialized knowledge that only a few possessed, that died when those individuals drowned. Techniques that required materials no longer available. Understanding that depended on landmarks now underwater. The survivors would have carried forward what they could remember, and they would have tried to write it down once writing was redeveloped, because they understood how easily memory fades. How quickly the details of the old world could become confused, distorted, lost. This is what the Sumerian tablets are. Not the invention of myth, not the creation of religion, but the preservation of memory, imperfect, fragmentary, mixed with later interpretations and theological overlay. But underneath it all, a genuine attempt to record what was remembered about the world before. The flood traditions are consistent across cultures that should have no contact with one another. Mesopotamian, Hebrew, Greek, Indian, Chinese, Mesoamerican, all carry stories of a great deluge that destroyed the world and required humanity to begin again. Scholars explain this as independent invention. Floods are common. People everywhere experience them. So people everywhere create flood myths. But these are not simple flood stories. They are world-ending flood stories. They describe not a river overflowing, but the entire earth being covered. They describe not a local disaster, but a global reset. And they describe it in remarkably similar terms. The waters rose beyond all precedent, covered the mountains, drowned the world, and only a few survived to rebuild. If these stories were independent inventions based on local flood experiences, we would expect more variation, different causes, different outcomes, different moral lessons. But instead we get the same structure repeated across the world. Warning, survival, covenant, new beginning. This suggests a common source, a shared memory, an actual event so catastrophic that every culture that survived it carried the story forward, and that story remained recognizable even after thousands of years of independent transmission. The ice melted, the seas rose, the coastlines drowned. This is not speculation. This is established geology. The question is not whether it happened, but whether it happened quickly enough and dramatically enough to create the kind of traumatic memory that would survive 10,000 years of retelling. Recent research suggests it may have, that the ice did not melt uniformly but in surges, that there were periods of rapid melting when vast ice dams broke and released enormous quantities of water into the oceans. That sea levels could have risen by meters in a matter of years, not the gradual rise over millennia that earlier models suggested. If this is true, if there were episodes of catastrophic flooding interspersed with periods of relative stability, then the flood traditions make perfect historical sense. They are describing what actually happened. Not metaphorically, not theologically, actually. The waters rose. The world people knew drowned. Those who survived moved inland and carried with them the memory of what was lost. And that memory, preserved in story and eventually in writing, became the flood traditions we still tell today. The Anunnaki, in this reading, are not gods or aliens or mythological inventions. They are simply the people who lived before, the ones who built the drowned cities, the ones who possessed the knowledge that the survivors inherited. They were remembered as greater than human because they came from a world that was, in some ways, greater, more established, longer lived, more stable. A world that had existed for so long that those who lived in it could accumulate knowledge across generations in ways that became impossible after the flood, when survival became more precarious and continuity more difficult. When the flood came, most of them died. Their cities drowned. Their libraries were destroyed. Their traditions were interrupted. But some survived. And those survivors, knowing that their world was ending, did what they could to preserve what mattered most. They taught the highland people how to farm the river valleys, how to build irrigation systems, how to organize labor, how to track the stars and mark the seasons, how to write so that knowledge could be preserved beyond the limits of human memory. And then, as their numbers dwindled and the new world stabilized, they withdrew. They let the people they had taught take ownership of the knowledge. They let humanity become the inheritor of civilization rather than the eternal student. This is not a story of gods. It is a story of tragedy and pragmatism and hope, of a people who faced annihilation and chose to pass forward what they could rather than let it die with them entirely. The Sumerian tablets remember this, imperfectly, mixed with later theology, transformed by time into myth. But the memory is there, if we know how to look for it. If we are willing to consider that the stories might be pointing towards something real. The tablets sit in museums now, behind glass, under controlled light. Clay fragments pressed with wedge-shaped marks that most visitors walk past without stopping. Ancient shopping lists, they think. Temple records. The bureaucratic debris of a long-dead civilization. But some tablets whisper differently to those who pause long enough to listen. They whisper of a world that drowned, of kingship that descended twice, of beings called Anunnaki who were present and then were not, of lifetimes so long they cannot be reconciled with what we know of human biology, of a flood that divided all of history into before and after. We have choices in how we hear these whispers. We can dismiss them as mythology, as primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena, as the confused products of prescientific minds trying to make sense of a world they did not understand. Or we can consider another possibility, that the Sumerians understood more than we credit them with, that they were not inventing stories, but preserving memories, that the tablets contain, beneath the theological overlay and the distortions of time, a genuine record of what happened when the world changed and humanity had to begin again. The ice melted, the waters rose, the coastlines drowned. This we know from geology, from ice cores, from the patient measurement of what the earth remembers. What we do not know is what was lost beneath those waters. What cities may have stood where now there is only ocean. What knowledge may have existed that drowned before it could be written down. What people may have lived and built and known things we are still trying to rediscover. The Anunnaki may have been those people, not gods, not aliens, simply the ones who came before. The inheritors of the world before the flood, who became the teachers of the world after, and who then withdrew into silence and memory. Or perhaps they were something else entirely. Perhaps the truth is stranger than either mythology or rationalism allows. Perhaps there are explanations we have not yet imagined because we are still too certain of what is possible. What remains is this: the stories persist. Across cultures, across millennia, the memory of a world that ended and began again refuses to fade. It is carried forward in flood traditions, in king lists, in tablets pressed into clay by hands that understood they were preserving something important, even if they could no longer say exactly what. We are the inheritors of that preservation. We carry forward what they saved. We build atop the ruins of what they rebuilt. We remember imperfectly what they remembered imperfectly from those who came before them. And perhaps, on quiet nights when the world feels older than we can explain, we sense it still. The weight of deep time, the presence of forgotten things, the knowledge that what we think we know about our own history may be incomplete. The tablets sit behind glass, patient and silent, waiting, perhaps, for us to ask better questions, waiting for us to wonder not just what the Sumerians believed, but what they remembered, waiting for us to consider that the global reset they described so carefully, so consistently, across so many texts, might have been exactly what they said it was: an ending, a drowning, a world unmade, so that ours could begin.